Hey everyone, welcome back to the YOUnify podcast. My name is Brandyn Keating. I'm the co-founder of YOUnify, a nonprofit organization helping you flourish and thrive. I'm incredibly excited to be with Nathan Maynard today. Thanks so much for joining us, Nathan.
Excited to be here.
I'm always extra excited whenever I get to talk with anyone who is helping cultivate young people. As y'all know, here in YOUnify, we care a lot about helping people flourish and thrive and developing flourishing leaders. And whenever I get to talk with somebody who's helping the next generation, to me, that's just so impactful on the future of our flourishing. Mm-hmm. So Nathan is an educator. He's a best-selling author. He's the co-founder and CEO of YOUnify and a national leader in transforming school discipline through restorative and trauma-informed practices. He's the co-author of Hacking School Discipline, and his latest book is The Science of Discipline, which just came out like 2 days ago,
exactly.
Right? Amazing. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
And thanks so much for being here. I know that you've become a leading voice in rethinking school discipline. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about what originally pulled you into this work.
Yeah, for sure. So, as a kid, I had lived experiences that were a little unique than other of my friends, going through as a child. So after I graduated from Purdue University, I started out as a youth worker. So I was a youth worker for 7 years, and I worked with, incarcerated youth or youth that was involved with Department of Child Services.
Wow, out of college.
Right out of college, yeah. So I was 21 years old, working with these different kids. And, for the first, 7 years, I worked there. I worked directly on the unit. So what I did was I was able to understand how to look at accountability in a different lens, look at the complexity of their lives and the accountability sort of differently. And then from there, I started to bring those different practices into education and looking at ways that we can hold students accountable, look at logical consequences, but seek to understand and teach empathy. Because I believe that the more that we can connect to one another and understand how behavior impacts others, that's where we're going to stop the negative behaviors from occurring in schools.
Amazing. And so what does this work look like for you now? Can you tell folks a little bit about what YOUnify is up to and how the book relates?
Yes, definitely. So what YOUnify does is we have trainings, we have resources to go in and support educators to scale these different practices.
Amazing.
After my first book came out, 7 years ago, I took those practices and I power tested them across the United States.
Wow.
And I would go to some of the most complex schools around and, work at those different schools, and I would see what was working, what wasn't working. So what YOUnify has done is synthesize those different practices, created sort of our own evidence base around it, and now we're scaling those practices to educators.
Fantastic. And can you tell us a little bit more about what young Nathan was like?
Yeah.
How did you become this guy who's taken on this incredibly challenging mission?
Yes. So I was a, go-getter as a kid. I always had a lot of energy. I had a lot of stuff going on. In school, I struggled. I was sometimes labeled like a class clown. I would sort of like act out in certain situations to go through. I was trying to find a sense of belonging sometimes through, negative behaviors instead of some of the other different types of behaviors, the more that I would do things. Then the older I became, the more I started realizing that, how powerful agency is, but sometimes it's a little too powerful when you're a kid and you need logical consequences and accountability. So I was forming and storming as a kid a lot. I was pushing against systems. I was very oppositional. I would walk out of school sometimes. There were certain situations that I just didn't want to be around in these different environments. So when I got older, I was able to look at things through my perspective a little bit differently.
Could relate to the young people who are having the same struggles.
Exactly. So even when I write a lot, I talk about my childhood some and talk about how I was able to relate to a lot of the youth I worked with through my childhood.
Incredible. Yeah. And you mentioned the word belonging, which I feel like transcends education. I feel like when we think about humans in any context, belonging is such a strong motivator for how we behave and can go in a positive or negative direction, right?
Yep.
I feel like we're seeing that in our politics a lot right now. People looking for a sense of belonging in ways that maybe aren't always the most
Exactly.
constructive.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious.
Polarized.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'm curious if you can unpack a little bit more how belonging shows up in your work and how you work with that in order to help the youth go in a positive direction.
Of course. So I think when you're looking at school discipline as a whole, I like to think about proactive things and responsive things.
Oh,
on
interesting.
The proactive side, I'm focused on a sense of belonging. What can I do to really understand and get the kids to have a connected classroom community? So when the kid is learning their personality, they're going through challenges, they have failures, they have celebrations, they have a community that starts to embrace them or understand them a little bit more. So I help teachers be more proactive with relational based skills in the classroom around those different practices to increase that sense of belonging. Because we also know there's push and pull factors for criminality. And those push and pull factors sometimes is around a sense of belonging also. So as a kid, when I was in middle school, I started to associate with people that were running around with a local street gang in Marion, Indiana. And I was doing this not because I wanted to be a criminal, not because I wanted to do criminal stuff, but I wanted that sense of belonging.
Yes.
And when you have a special handshake and you have this type of stuff and you go through, you feel sort of different in this time. And as a young kid, not really knowing what I was experiencing at the time, it felt exciting. It felt like I get a sense of belonging right here. So what I try to do for schools is say, we have to make the schools more exciting. We've got to make the relationships better. Like we've got to increase that sense of what the belonging factors pull kids into and focus on that proactive side of it.
I love the idea of schools being sort of a proactive hub of belonging, especially since they reach beyond just the children and have interaction with the parents and so forth, etc. So this is some pretty intense work that you do.
It is.
For people who maybe only know you through this work, what is something that they might be surprised to know about you? Like a hobby or a talent or...
I don't know if this would be a surprise, but I mean, like I'm very specific with my food. I don't drink, very much sugar to go through. I watch what I eat to go through. One thing that might be surprising is I used to weigh 100 pounds heavier than I was now.
Oh,
so
really?
I've lost a lot of weight. I changed my lifestyle up a lot. I gained the weight when I was 23 years old. I had actually tumors on my pituitary gland.
Wow.
And they were prolactinomas at the time. So I was doing these different things. The doctors didn't know what was going on with it. So they kept, trying different things to go through. And they finally did an MRI and said, Nathan, you got multiple brain tumors on your pituitary gland. And then I was in treatment for several years. They were going to cut out my pituitary gland. I mean, all this different stuff to go through. But I changed my diet. I started praying a lot, meditating a lot, doing different things. And I don't have any brain tumors now to go through. And I've lost all the different weight. So I think healthy lifestyles really play into holistic health. Like a lot of my even good friends that I have, I've met them in the health space a lot of times. So some people may know me as a disciplined person, but some people know me as I'm very healthy. Like I try to be as healthy as I can sometimes.
Yeah, incredible. And as you know, we talk a lot about flourishing and YOUnify. For yourself personally, what's something that's helping you flourish and thrive right now, and maybe something that you're a little bit challenged by?
Yeah, I would say what helps me flourish and thrive. I mean, I have a 11-year-old son, and just seeing the way he understands and lives in the world through a parent is so much more different than me as an educator when I was for 18 years to go through. So I think that something that helps me thrive and flourish is just thinking about my son and thinking about how all of these kids out there in the school system is somebody's child. I mean, there's somebody's child. So we have to look at all these kids in that same type of lens.
Yeah, and everybody we interact with day to day, right? Even if they're grown, they're somebody's child as well. Yeah. So you often talk about moving away from fear-based discipline. What's broken about the traditional model, and what does it look like to move away from that fear-based discipline? For
sure. So I think when you're thinking about getting upstream, like we talked about earlier, for the proactive and the sense of belonging, you've got to think, if we're trying to make kids feel like they belong in an environment, does fear belong in that same environment? And if this environment is a small micro community of kids, 15, 20, 30 kids together, and you're trying to make this a fun, relational based environment where vulnerability happens, learning happens, all these different things take place, how is this going to change when fear comes into the mix? So what we start to see when fear gets pushed in the mix for discipline, we start to see oppositional behaviors come out. We start to see certain kids that sort of dramatically shut down in situations. We see insubordination. We see ostracism start to occur with certain kids as well. We see these different things start to continue to occur. So getting more upstream and being proactive and being on the sense of belonging means that we have to look at accountability differently. The accountability can't just be on fear-based discipline, because if it's always on that, you're going to create opposition, you're going to disrupt the environment, and it's going to be sort of combative. So I look at extrinsic motivators and intrinsic motivators for human behaviors, because I think a lot of the stuff I write about is around human behavior and motivation around those different human behaviors. So when you mix those things together, the fear is a very punitive extrinsic factor.
It sounds like it's having the opposite of the desired effect.
It does. But sometimes to the teacher, it feels like it works, because then the kid sits up straight, or they're scared you're going to call the parent or something like that. But what is that fear doing to that kid? How
it's
much?
Like a temporary fix.
Yes. And then also, if we continue doing fear with these kids over and over again, how's that go into their development? How's their sense of self? Do they look at themselves as broken? Do they look at themselves as great? Like what does these things start to do to the kid's development? Yeah.
So for a teacher who's like, maybe they want to move away from the fear-based, but there's like a nervousness of if I don't have this thing that I've been socialized to believe is the way to get children to be compliant, what advice would you give them, both about what practices to start to incorporate and how to feel comfortable in making that transition?
For sure. So I would say starting out, with discipline, is logical accountability. But I also think about replacement skills. So if a kid is struggling with the behavior, or they have a negative behavior that occurs, what skill do I need to teach them? Because discipline, the root word of discipline is discern, a Latin word which means to model, to learn, to teach, discipleship. We've got to think about, in schools, how do we start to build stuff up to teach kids a replacement skill? So for example, at my high school, I had kids that once they got into their second fight, I would put them into aggression replacement training, anger management. And I had my school counselors teach anger management during lunch. So then the kids every Tuesday and Thursday, sometimes for a month or 2 months, would grab their lunch. They'd go down to the school counselor and they would work on anger management. They would work
develop positive skills.
Exactly, as replacement skills. So next time someone kicks the back of your chair, you don't have to jump up and scream at them or yell or get into a fight.
Right.
You can communicate, or you can redirect this way, but you can't unless your brain's regulated. So I teach them those types of skills, and those are the replacement skills in discipline. So for a new teacher, I would think about, what is the skill I'm trying to teach to make them successful through this environment or even long term?
And so you mentioned intrinsic and extrinsic skills. Can you break that down a little bit as well? Or sorry, motivators, I think you said. Can you break down a little bit what those words mean and what that looks like in practice? Like what are some of each of those motivators?
So extrinsic motivators is, on the psychology term, it's called the carrot and stick method. So if you have a rabbit and you want the rabbit to get into a hole, you can dangle a carrot in front of the hole, and the rabbit goes to try to grab the carrot and it falls into the hole because you did a positive incentive, the positive extrinsic motivator, to try to get it to go in the hole.
So extrinsic outside of me.
And then another one is pain. So the stick method. So another one, so carrot, you dangle the stick, you smack the rabbit with the stick as much until the rabbit's uncomfortable, and then it goes into the hole. So both ways the rabbit is in the hole, but does the rabbit want to be in the hole, right? Because one, it thought it was getting a carrot, or it did get the carrot, but now it's in a hole. And the other one, like, it was moving away from pain. Both those are extrinsic factors. Intrinsic says, that hole looks cool, or my teacher told me to go into this hole, because I'm a rabbit, and like this hole is safe for me to go into. So I decide to go into this different thing. The hole
is awesome. It's cozy.
Yeah. So there's ways to mix different extrinsic and intrinsic factors. Like, we obviously don't hit kids with sticks to get them into a hole to go through, but we push with high expectations. We hold the students accountable. We give them this many chances before it turns into a consequence. We make sure the consequence is logical and accountability. So we start to mix those extrinsic factors, but on the intrinsic side, understanding why they're doing what they're doing and why they should do something different.
Amazing. So if a teacher, or maybe even a parent, it seems like these would be relevant skills for parents as well, is watching or listening, and they're thinking, okay, this sounds good. And it sounds like a lot to try to implement. What's the best place to start?
Well, I would say, checking out my book's a good first start, because
Don't forget to check out the book.
Because it shows the replacement skills in there. And it talks about like, you have a student or your kid that's lying. What's a couple different things that you can do with it? You have a student or your kid that's stealing. What's a couple different things that you can do differently? Because all these moments create opportunities and these opportunities to teach. So in the book, I try to walk down different ways to break down those opportunities to be more disciplined to teach, in those methods.
So it breaks it down, makes it kind of bite-sized and easy. And I love the framing of an opportunity, that each one of these challenges is an opportunity.
It is.
Amazing. And so if people want to get the book, where do they get it?
Yeah. So right now it's on, all major publishers, or all major distribution channels. So, whatever you feel, comfortable with buying your books from. We have a website called scienceofdiscipline.com. So you can sign
scienceofdiscipline.com.
Yeah. Okay. And then, that stuff is on the website where you can find the book that way as well.
Amazing. So Science of Discipline, folks, if you are excited about what Nathan is sharing and you want to integrate some of it in your own life, we'll have all the links below on the YouTube version of the podcast, and will be in our bio or in comments across all of the other platforms. And if you're liking what you're hearing, if you're enjoying the podcast, another way that you can help make a difference, help more people get access to this information, is by clicking the like, clicking the subscribe, totally free, dropping a comment. We'd love to hear what you think, what you're challenged by in terms of young people and discipline. Maybe even if some of these topics feel relevant to your own life, or some of these concepts feel relevant to your own life. And also sharing is really helpful as well to help get the information to more people. So Nathan, when we think about holding students accountable, which you've talked a lot about, one of the phrases that I think you use in your work is holding students accountable without losing their humanity, which I love.
For sure.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
So it goes down to treating the student with respect. In a situation, especially after wrongdoing occurs or the kid makes a mistake in a situation, how do we look at the situation and say, okay, what is the harm caused and to whom? Instead of saying this is a good kid or this is a bad kid to go through. When you start to label kids, you start to break down the way they feel about themselves. And that's why I said the humanity part. And when kids are vulnerable, going through their development and understanding how to interact with their friends or educators or different people around them, they're sensitive. And when those things are sensitive and taking place, we've got to think through just different ways to understand the student's behavior, ways to look at those different behaviors as communication skills, and ways to really build different paths, around that.
And part of what I feel like you're sharing is really remembering the humanization of children, that which I feel like is important across all human relationships, right? There's so much happening in our world right now where, there's a push to maybe dehumanize people, which causes a change in what we think is acceptable in a way to treat them. So I love the idea that you are really helping enculturate this idea of seeing the full human and remembering everybody's humanity. Is there an example that you could share about maybe where a school dramatically changed their outcomes by shifting their discipline approach? Yeah,
definitely. So there's a school district that I started working with, and this was in the metro Atlanta area, at the time. And at the time, they wanted to work with us because they were noticing that their discipline was disproportionate. So they were certain students were getting in the discipline system faster than other students. So they wanted to see, where's this disproportionality coming from? They also had a high amount of suicides that were taking place at the time at this district. And this was a high performing district in most of the schools, some lower, socioeconomic status, but the highest amount of suicide completions they've ever had in a year. So the person that was tasked to say, how can we stop this from happening? His name was Dr. Ben Lester. He reached out to me and he said, Nathan, I want you to come and start doing book studies with my first book to my educators, because I think that what you're doing gets upstream for some of these different things of maybe the disproportionality and some of the stuff around the suicide, the ideations and all this type of stuff. So what we did was we started doing, book studies across their schools. Then from there, we broke up all of their schools into cohorts, and I started doing trainings with the biggest schools first. So we took a couple elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, and it took me 3 years to get through all the different schools to train them. But we created different pathways and different, groups and stuff. So now the chief operating officer of this district goes around the United States and they talk about high five and my work and saying like that reduced, suspensions by last year, 29,700 days less of out of school suspension at that one district alone.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah, and it's astronomical when you think of the impact. Like UCLA did a study and it saves taxpayers tons and tons of money by not suspending students.
So there's a ripple effect to the entire community.
A lot of our homeless communities in different communities are kids that struggled in school and they had one suspension and this is their path that they go into. So there's so many ripples of that 29,700 days of out of school suspensions less based on the programming, the teachers being training was huge, but they also had dramatic drops across with suicide completions, suicide ideations, because they went more upstream and they started focusing on a sense of belonging. And how does the teachers increase their relationship? How do you not tokenize the relationship either? How do you increase the quality of that relationship? And we believe that helps sort of go upstream for that district.
Incredible. And so when teachers are in really high pressure situations, I know a lot of schools are understaffed, teachers might feel overwhelmed. How do you help them balance structure and compassion in those sort of high pressure scenarios?
Yeah, and that's a good question, because the thing is, I feel like we have to respect, when you understand empathy, you've got to respect everyone, right? You've got to understand that empathy doesn't just go to the kid that's struggling with trauma. It goes with the educator struggling with the kid with trauma as well.
Exactly.
Right?
Their full humanity as well.
Exactly. And we understand a dysregulated brain can never regulate a dysregulated child. So we have to understand that it starts out by helping the educators stay regulated when they're processing situations, giving them strategies, tools, and frameworks to help them deal with discipline when it comes forward. Because like if something bad took place and we knew what we were going to do when this bad thing happened, we're going to feel less anxious. When a kid throws a desk over in the middle of the class because they've had trauma or something triggered them, the teacher doesn't know what happens and they get so anxious. So they've got to have a plan set up as well.
That makes sense. Absolutely. And you've also spoken a lot about the school to prison pipeline. How does discipline play into that issue? Yeah, so discipline. So the school to prison pipeline is a huge trend that we're seeing in our data, where there's disproportionality, especially with our students of color, especially with our Black and brown males specifically. What we're seeing is that sometimes in the education system, there's different factors that start to occur that slows down their ability to have the same opportunity as their other students across this environment. One of those things that slow things down is implicit bias. So implicit bias is a normal thing that everybody has, but you have to check it. You have to understand that it is formed based on your lived experiences, media that you've taken in, interactions, stuff like that to go through. So, and could you just break down for people who aren't familiar with the term, maybe what implicit bias is?
Of course. So implicit bias is when you have an immediate reaction to something without your brain actively thinking about it. So if there was a Coca-Cola bottle and a Pepsi bottle right here, both of these taste sort of similar. I mean, I'm sure we can argue which one's different and stuff, but I'm going to probably grab which one that I think, and I'm not going to think too much about it, right? Like, Coca-Cola is probably going to be my go-to in that situation to go through. Someone else, Pepsi might, but they don't have to think about it. Implicit bias is that innate sense that I grab that Coca-Cola bottle instead of that Pepsi bottle. But sometimes when the classrooms take place, we're noticing that our eyes notice certain students differently. Our ears pick up on certain things differently too, same way that we pick up that Coca-Cola bottle. So what starts...
Based on how they look or...
Exactly. So even, there's a study done looking at preschool teachers and where their eyes went and looking at students in the classroom. And the students that they looked the most at was the Black and brown males, then it was the white males, then it was the then it was the white females, and then it was Black and brown females last to go through. So when you're thinking about this, the Black and brown males are being looked at the most, Black and brown females are being looked at the least. So then you think about the way we start to think about bias and even just things coming up. So sometimes you say Black and brown females might be louder in situations, maybe because they were being not looked at as much in education. Then we look at our Black and brown male students in the classroom as well, and we say those behaviors look differently in this sense. But when we look at the other peers' behaviors, they're also different as well. So it's that Pepsi Coke can sort of situation, but it happens very, very quickly.
Without us even knowing.
Yeah, and they've seen this just with even preschool's teachers' eye contact of where they're looking at based on studies. So it just comes out. We just have to be aware of it, especially as a white male. I've got to be aware of what I pay attention to a little bit differently sometimes.
And so you also said the way we use power with children shapes the future of society. For sure. What do you mean by that?
So I think that when you're thinking about students, we have 50 million kids in the education system for 13 years of their life. And when we're thinking about what forms society, a lot of times you have families that form society, there's religious institutions that form society, there's economics that form society, and there's schools. Schools train society more than any of those other institutions.
Absolutely.
The other institutions are sometimes you can jump around. Schools, you're mandatory to be in schools for that 13 years. So when I say that schools form society, looking at even what Plato talked about in the Republic, looking at different things, we can really form society to be more empathetic if we start in our school system and understand different ways to do it, because we train these kids through those different 13 years of their life.
So the leadership and policy choices that we make in a school setting ripple throughout the entire society.
Of course. Yeah, it's huge.
And so if somebody wanted to kind of get started on implementing some of this tomorrow with just one baby step, they should definitely get the book, right?
Yeah, definitely, of course.
But in terms of anybody listening or watching, maybe they would like to implement one of these practices in a school setting or with their kids at home, or maybe even with adults who are different than them, where there's some conflict. What's one small thing that they could do as a start that they could try out?
I would say when you're seeing someone upset you, it doesn't have to be your kid, doesn't have to be a student if you're an educator, but just when someone upsets you, be curious. Be curious behind the behavior and say, what else could be going on? You know, when someone cuts me off in traffic, I used to get mad. Now I think in my head, what if they were running to the hospital right now to see their son one last time? And if I was running to the hospital one last time, I'm cutting everybody off in traffic, you know, like, you know, so like I'm going through. So like start to be just more curious in the situation. And I think when you have that curiosity, it opens up to other strategies. You know, I talk about being an embodied practitioner of this type of work. And when I tell educators this, it means you have to believe that kids deserve a chance to succeed. You have to believe that these opportunities are there, you know, that we have, and we've got to really push that the kids can succeed in all environments. Not all environments, kids can succeed in environments. We've got to think about that different environment and what factors we can improve, change, or adapt to make that kid successful.
Curiosity, such a superpower, y'all. That comes up. I swear I didn't plant it with Nathan. It comes up on this podcast so often.
It's huge.
It is such a superpower.
It is. It really is. It really is.
Yeah. Incredible. Okay. So we have the book. We have the for-profit entity. We have the nonprofit entity. We'll put links for everything below on YouTube in the description and across socials in the comments if you're seeing this on socials. How can people help? How can people get involved? How can people use this to serve themselves?
For sure. I would say, starting to serve yourself with this, I would say, picking up the practices and just seeing if it works for you, trying it with, a loved one, with a friend, with your kid, and seeing if those things work would be, a great first step.
And there you're serving your whole community as well, right?
Exactly. And everything's a ripple, like every impact that you have in your life is a ripple, even if it's someone on the side of the road. So I would say just start practicing this type of stuff and seeing how people around you start to change, or see how you start to feel differently in these situations to go through. And I'd say if other people want to get involved too, if you're an educator, I would love to, chat to see if, these are practices that we can bring to your school. I think that we've seen this really change school systems. I've worked in a lot of complex schools. I've worked in schools that haven't had complexities, but want to just improve or change stuff up a little bit differently too. And then I think that, for givers out there, we do have a foundation where we do sponsor schools to bring this work into the schools. We focus on underserved and underprivileged schools as well. So
people can help you actually reach more schools by donating to the nonprofit, and the which schools, is tax deductible as well, right?
Absolutely, yes. And the schools very much need this work around. I've been around the United States. My first book sold 300,000 copies, which is hard to sell a lot of copies of a book, but it's because educators read this book and they said, okay, there's something here to go through. So then I've been bringing these practices around for 8 years, but some schools can't afford it in the way that sometimes budgets start to go. So that's why, giving and foundations help us get into the schools, and then we can expand this work from there.
Amazing. All right, y'all. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. We will have, again, all of the links to connect with Nathan and this incredible work below, which can not only help you personally in your community. Like, I love the fact that as people are implementing these practices, they're regulating their own nervous systems as well. Yep. So it's a win-win-win all around. So we'll see you next time, y'all. And thanks so much for joining us, Nathan.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's
absolutely. Been great. Yeah. And so how much more time do you have?